And the verse is this. It says, today was Angie's birthday, and it must have slipped your mind.
The verse tells the story of a forgotten birthday, unanswered phone calls, and a package sent with love signed from a mother so a child wouldn't know. That sense of quiet distance and emotional weight perfectly mirrors the life and career of Dwight Yoakam, a story shaped by both triumph and mystery. By bucking trends and refusing to conform, Dwight rose to fame at a time when country music was drifting toward polished pop sounds. He became a favorite singer among artists themselves, admired for his grit and authenticity, yet just as suddenly as he skyrocketed, he seemed to vanish from the spotlight. What happened to this country music rebel, and where did he go? In his prime, Dwight Yoakam stood in direct opposition to the Nashville establishment. While his peers leaned into sugary ballads and crossover hits, Dwight was on a mission to reclaim the roots of country music. His boldness caught the attention of Buck Owens, and in 1987, Dwight famously showed up unannounced at Buck's office and convinced him to record a duet. The result, Streets of Bakersfield, became a massive hit and revived Buck Owens' career at a time when many believed his best days were behind him. But momentum doesn't always last. By the mid-1990s, Dwight's record sales were declining, and the industry that once tolerated him began to pull away. Rather than adjusting his image or sound, Dwight chose to disappear. For years, his music releases received little attention, and many assumed he had walked away entirely. In reality, he simply chose a different path. Dwight Yoakam was born on October 23, 1956, in Pikeville, Kentucky, and raised in Columbus, Ohio. He was the oldest of 3 children, and music entered his life early when his father handed him a guitar he couldn't learn to play himself. By the time Dwight was 8, he had his own guitar and had already begun writing songs. He absorbed country music from AM radio, records by Johnny Cash and Johnny Horton, and road trip sing-alongs with his family, while also falling under the spell of early rock and roll icons like Elvis Presley. In high school, Dwight played drums in the school band and took drama classes, gaining confidence through stage performance. He formed a rock band with friends, played local parties, and briefly attended Ohio State University before leaving to pursue music full-time. A fake record deal nearly derailed him early on, and his time in Nashville only reinforced his belief that the city had no place for the kind of honky-tonk music he wanted to make. Instead of Nashville, Dwight moved to Los Angeles, where punk, roots music, and country unexpectedly collided. There, he met guitarist and producer Pete Anderson, and together they forged a sound inspired by Buck Owens, Merle Haggard, and the Bakersfield tradition. Albums like Guitars, Cadillacs, and Hillbilly Deluxe and Buenas Noches from a Lonely Room brought Dwight mainstream success without compromising his identity. But Dwight never stopped challenging the industry. He openly criticized record labels, MTV, and the treatment of country legends, and his refusal to soften his image eventually cost him industry support. As his music career slowed, Dwight redirected his focus to acting. What many didn't expect was how successful he would become on screen. Dwight built a strong acting resume, earning praise for roles in films like Red Rock West, Sling Blade, The Newton Boys, Panic Room, and Wedding Crashers. He developed a reputation for playing intense, morally complex characters, a sharp contrast to his musical persona. His performance in Sling Blade helped earn a Screen Actors Guild Award for the cast, cementing his credibility as an actor. Emboldened by that success, Dwight took a major risk by writing, directing, starring in, and scoring his own western, South of Heaven, West of Hell. When financing collapsed just before production, he funded the project himself, selling personal property to keep it alive. The gamble failed. The film was a critical and commercial disaster, his production company went bankrupt, lawsuits followed, and longtime collaborators were let go. It took years for Dwight to recover financially. Despite setbacks in both music and film, Dwight never stopped creating. He continued acting, returned to music on his own terms, and slowly rebuilt his career. In 2012, he released 3 pairs, marking a creative comeback that was warmly received by longtime fans. In an industry that had changed dramatically, Dwight found a new space where artists no longer needed chart dominance to survive. His personal life also found stability. After years of highly publicized relationships in the 1990s, Dwight settled into a private relationship with photographer Emily Joyce. The two married quietly in 2020 and welcomed a son shortly afterward, proving that reinvention doesn't have an expiration date. Today, Dwight Yoakam remains active as a musician, actor, entrepreneur, and family man. While he is notably absent from the Country Music Hall of Fame, his influence on modern country and roots music is undeniable. He helped drag the genre back to its raw core when it desperately needed grounding, and he did it without asking permission. Dwight Yoakam didn't disappear. He stepped sideways, survived the fallout of his independence, and emerged on his own terms. His story isn't about defeat. It's about endurance, conviction, and staying true even when the spotlight fades. The slow burn, and the quiet recalibration of a man who refused to be reshaped by systems larger than himself. Dwight Yoakam did not disappear because he failed. He disappeared because he chose not to bend, and the cost of that decision followed him for decades. By the late 1990s, Dwight Yoakam stood at a crossroads that few artists ever truly survive. His commercial peak was behind him, his relationship with Nashville was strained beyond repair, and the film industry, while welcoming, had not yet fully proven itself as a long-term refuge. He was respected, but not embraced. Admired, but rarely celebrated. To the industry, Dwight was difficult. To fans, he was uncompromising. To himself, he was unfinished. The collapse of South of Heaven, West of Hell marked the most painful chapter of his career. What had begun as a passion project meant to reclaim creative control became a financial and emotional catastrophe. The lawsuits, the debts, and the public failure weighed heavily on him. For years afterward, Dwight avoided speaking openly about the film, not out of shame, but exhaustion. It had taken everything from him, not just money, but trust. Relationships that had lasted decades were severed, including his creative partnership with Pete Anderson, the guitarist and producer who had helped define his sound from the very beginning. The end of that collaboration was not just a business split. It was the closing of a chapter that had defined Dwight's musical identity. Anderson's sharp Bakersfield guitar lines had been inseparable from Dwight's voice, and their separation signaled a deeper transformation. Dwight was no longer trying to recreate the past. He was trying to survive the present. During this period, Dwight turned inward. He acted more than he recorded. He accepted roles that challenged him psychologically rather than elevated him commercially. Characters became darker, more complicated, often morally broken. Films like Panic Room, The Minus Man, and The Three Burials of Melquiades Estrada reflected a man exploring the edges of human behavior, perhaps because he was living on those edges himself. Yet even in this quieter era, Dwight never stopped writing music. He simply stopped chasing approval. The industry had changed, and so had he. Radio no longer dictated relevance. Album sales no longer defined worth. For the first time, Dwight was free from the illusion that success had to look a certain way. Behind the scenes, he was also reckoning with something more personal: solitude. Dwight Yoakam had spent much of his adult life on the road, in studios, or on film sets. Fame had surrounded him with people, but not permanence. His high-profile relationships in the 1990s had drawn attention, but they never offered grounding. Over time, Dwight became more guarded, more private, and increasingly selective about who had access to his life. That privacy became intentional. He moved away from the public eye not because he feared it, but because he no longer needed it. In an era of constant exposure, Dwight chose restraint. He stopped explaining himself. He stopped correcting narratives. He allowed silence to do the work noise once did. As the 2000s progressed, a strange thing happened. Younger artists began citing Dwight Yoakam as a foundational influence. Alternative country, Americana, and roots revival scenes embraced the very sound Nashville once rejected. The Bakersfield influence resurfaced everywhere, and Dwight's early records were reevaluated not as outliers, but as blueprints. Without trying to reclaim relevance, Dwight had become timeless. In 2012, when Three Pairs was released, it wasn't marketed as a comeback. It didn't need to be. The album was confident, experimental, and unbothered by trends. It blended distortion with tradition, melancholy with restraint. Critics praised it not because it reached back, but because it moved forward honestly. Dwight wasn't chasing his younger self. He was documenting who he had become. The album quietly reaffirmed something his fans had always known. Dwight Yoakam never lost his talent. He simply refused to package it. Around this time, his personal life underwent its most profound shift. After decades of independence, Dwight found stability with Emily Joyce, a photographer far removed from the machinery of celebrity. Their relationship unfolded privately, deliberately shielded from public consumption. For nearly a decade, they lived outside the narrative entirely, untouched by rumor or spectacle. When they married in 2020, it surprised many, not because Dwight seemed incapable of commitment, but because he had so thoroughly separated his personal life from his public identity. The arrival of his son later that year reframed everything. At an age when most artists reflect backward, Dwight looked forward. Fatherhood grounded him in ways fame never could. This chapter of his life was quieter, but not smaller. It was expansive in a different way. Time was no longer something to outrun. It was something to inhabit. Professionally, Dwight continued to work steadily. He appeared in television series like Goliath and Under the Dome, delivering performances that were restrained, controlled, and deeply human. He no longer played characters for attention. He played them for truth. Behind the scenes, he also fought one of his most significant battles, not with critics or executives, but with ownership. When his catalog was removed from streaming platforms due to contractual disputes, Dwight took legal action, not for profit, but for principle. He believed artists should control their work, especially the work that defined their lives. When the dispute was resolved and his music returned to streaming services, it wasn't framed as a victory. It was framed as a correction. Dwight Yoakam has never been interested in winning. He's interested in being right with himself. Even today, his absence from the Country Music Hall of Fame remains a quiet controversy. His influence is undeniable. His catalog is foundational. His contributions reshaped the genre. Yet the institution that once resisted him still hesitates to fully embrace him. Dwight has never publicly complained. He doesn't campaign. He doesn't lobby. Recognition, to him, is hollow if it comes with conditions. He once said that he learned early on that his opinions about the industry were irrelevant to his survival as an artist. What mattered was the work. So he focused on the work. And the work endures. Dwight Yoakam exists now in a rare space. He is neither legacy act nor nostalgia figure. He is active, evolving, and uncontained. His music continues to resonate with listeners who crave authenticity over polish. His films continue to find new audiences. His influence quietly shapes artists who may never fully realize where their sound came from. He is not louder than the room anymore. He doesn't need to be. His presence is felt without announcement. The story of Dwight Yoakam is not a cautionary tale. It is a survival story. It is about what happens when conviction outlasts validation. When integrity costs everything, but gives something back in return. He did not vanish. He endured. And in a world that rewards compliance and forgets resistance, that may be his greatest legacy of all. By the time Dwight Yoakam entered what many would call the later stage of his career, the idea of relevance had already lost its meaning to him. He had outlived trends, formats, and entire industry cycles. The systems that once rejected him had either collapsed or reinvented themselves, while he remained largely unchanged at his core. That consistency, once considered a liability, had quietly become his greatest strength. Dwight never chased reinvention for its own sake. He didn't shave his edges to appeal to younger audiences, nor did he exaggerate his legacy to preserve status. Instead, he allowed time to pass honestly. That honesty became audible in his voice, visible in his performances, and evident in his choices. Where he once fought institutions head-on, he now simply walked around them. This evolution didn't come from surrender. It came from clarity. In the years following his legal and financial struggles, Dwight became deeply protective of his creative output. He began approaching projects not as opportunities for exposure, but as extensions of identity. Acting roles were chosen carefully, often portraying men who lived on the margins, men shaped by consequence rather than ambition. These characters weren't glamorous. They were fractured, restrained, and emotionally weathered. Dwight understood them instinctively. He once remarked that acting and music were not so different, because both required repetition and restraint. What he didn't say explicitly was that both also required vulnerability, and vulnerability had become something he guarded fiercely. No longer interested in spectacle, he leaned into subtlety. As the entertainment industry shifted toward constant visibility, Dwight moved in the opposite direction. He rarely gave interviews. When he did, his answers were thoughtful, measured, and often deflective. He spoke about process instead of persona, about craft instead of conflict. The controversies that once followed him no longer had oxygen. He didn't refute them. He outlasted them. Meanwhile, the cultural reassessment of country music continued. Younger listeners began discovering Dwight's early albums not as historical artifacts, but as living documents. Guitars, Cadillacs, and Hillbilly Deluxe sounded rawer than much of what followed it. Buenas noches from a lonely room felt cinematic in a way that modern listeners found surprisingly contemporary. Dwight's refusal to smooth the edges of heartbreak gave those records longevity. They didn't age. They waited. This rediscovery was organic. Dwight didn't orchestrate it. Streaming platforms, vinyl reissues, and word of mouth carried his work into new spaces. His audience grew not because he adapted, but because the world eventually caught up to him. At the same time, Dwight's sense of home changed. For much of his life, home had been temporary. Hotels, tour buses, soundstages, and studios blurred together. Stability was something other people had. But with marriage and fatherhood, time slowed. The future became tangible. Fatherhood, in particular, altered his internal rhythm. Dwight spoke rarely about it publicly, but those close to him noticed the shift. His priorities realigned. Success was no longer measured by output, but by presence. The long hours, the endless travel, the constant motion that once defined his life became negotiable. He didn't stop working. He worked differently. In music, this meant fewer releases, but deeper intention. He no longer felt pressure to comment on the state of the genre. He had already said what needed to be said. Now, he allowed songs to exist without explanation. If listeners found themselves in them, that was enough. His voice, once described as a plaintive yodel edged with sweetness, deepened over time. The twang remained, but it carried weight. Experience settled into the sound. He didn't try to mask it. He leaned into it. There is a moment in every artist's life when the mirror stops reflecting potential and starts reflecting reality. For Dwight Yoakam, that moment didn't arrive with bitterness. It arrived with acceptance. He understood what he had done, what he hadn't done, and what he would never do again. He was fine with all of it. The distance between Dwight and Nashville never truly closed, but it softened. The industry that once viewed him as a problem now treated him as an elder statesman, albeit reluctantly. Invitations came. Tributes followed. Yet Dwight never re-entered the fold fully. He remained adjacent, observing rather than participating. That distance preserved his voice. In acting, his legacy followed a similar path. He was never marketed as a movie star, but he was trusted. Directors knew what he brought to a role: precision, restraint, and an absence of vanity. He didn't overplay scenes. He didn't chase attention. He let silence speak. That restraint made his performances linger. As time passed, Dwight's name became shorthand for authenticity. Not nostalgia, not rebellion, but integrity. Artists cited him not just for his sound, but for his stance. He proved that success did not require submission, even if resistance came at a cost. And the cost had been high. He lost momentum when others surged ahead. He lost relationships. He lost money. He lost industry support. But what he kept was autonomy. He kept authorship over his voice, his image, and his work. That autonomy gave him something few artists ever achieve: peace. Dwight Yoakam does not look back often. When he does, it's without regret. He understands that his path could not have unfolded any other way. The choices he made demanded the consequences he received. To him, compromise would have been the real failure. His story challenges the mythology of fame. It complicates the idea that success is linear, that relevance must be constant, that visibility equals value. Dwight's life suggests something quieter and more enduring, that staying true may cost everything in the short term, but it builds something unbreakable over time. Today, Dwight Yoakam exists in the margins of the mainstream by choice. He releases music when it matters to him. He acts when a role speaks to him. He lives privately. He parents deliberately. He no longer explains himself to people who weren't listening in the first place. He has become exactly what he always was, without resistance. The verse that began this story spoke of absence, of missed calls, of love delivered quietly through the mail. It was never about abandonment. It was about distance shaped by circumstance. Dwight Yoakam's life reflects that same distance. He was present, but not always visible. Loving, but not always understood. And yet, the package always arrived. Dwight Yoakam did not defeat the system. He simply outlived its expectations. He didn't win the argument. He walked away from it. And in doing so, he preserved something rare in modern culture, a career defined not by peaks and valleys, but by intention. His legacy is not a chart position or an award. It is a body of work that refuses to be diluted. It is a reminder that art does not need permission. It only needs conviction. Dwight Yoakam is still here. Not as a comeback story. Not as a cautionary tale. But as proof that endurance, when paired with integrity, is louder than fame ever was.